So this video lesson is over how to find the inverse of a function. So an inverse function, denoted as kind of that little -1 up there with that our f function, so inverse, a function that reverses another. So think of it kind of like the reverse. So the domain of the inverse is the range of the original function. And the range of the inverse is the domain of the original function. So we're just switching basically our x and y's. They're reversed. So how does that look for our ordered pair? We would have our 5 and 7 switch places, our 3 and 4 switch places, our 3 and 1, and then our 2 and -1. So that is the inverse of this ordered pair. The next question is, does the following have an inverse, or is the inverse a function? So here's its inverse, and we're going to just see if it is a function. So we need to look at all of our x values and see if any of them repeat. Right there. We have a 2 that repeats with different y values. So this is not a function. X's repeat with different y's. All right, so determine the inverse of this function. Is the inverse also a function? Well, first let's go ahead and find the inverse. So again, we're going to switch our x's and our y's, and so we're going to put our y's, or our output. The f of x is kind of like our y, or our output. We're going to put that first, then put our x second. So let's go ahead and put all those. 3, -1, -1, 0, 1, 2, -2, 3, 5, 4, and 1, -3. Now we're going to see if that's a function. So look for your x's, see if any of them repeat. And it looks like, oh, right here, ones. The ones repeat. So this is not a function. Not a function for our inverse. Inverse is not a function. Now, if we looked at our actual original function there, that's a function, but its inverse is not a function. Okay, so now how do we find the inverse of an equation or a function, not just an ordered pair here? Here's our steps. We're going to replace the f of x with a y, and then we're going to reverse the x and the y. So we're going to swap them. X becomes y, y becomes x. Then we'll solve for our y, and then we'll replace that with an f to the -1 power. That's the symbol for inverse. Okay, so let's go ahead and do it. Let's replace that with a y. Now we need to switch our x and our y. So this becomes x, and that becomes y. And now we're going to go ahead and solve, get y alone. So the first thing we need to undo is this 4 with subtraction. And then how do we undo a fraction? We multiply by its reciprocal. The other thing that you can do, I'll show you on this side here. So that's going to get rid of that. Its reciprocal is just flipping it. Not opposite reciprocal, just reciprocal. So we keep the sign with it. So now we're just left with a y. And then you can distribute this to each of those. Oops, I didn't flip it, did I? Whoopsie. Make sure that you do actually flip it. Don't just put the same thing. So it should be a -2 over 3. There we go. So that what happens here is this times this multiplies, that gives me 6, and this times this multiply, that gives me 6, and look, it's a 1. And we know there's always a 1 there. So we need to make sure that we do the actual inverse and not just rewrite it. There we go. So now let's go ahead and distribute that to each, so it's negative 2/3 x. We multiply the numerator times that number, so that gives me 8/3. And we're done, except for that last step. Replace this with an inverse function symbol there. So it's f to the negative 1 of x equals, and then we just rewrite this over here as it looks there. All right, so let's try it again. I'm going to do 5, and then I'm going to have you do 6. So replace that with a y. Flip your x and your y. Positions there, change those. So that's kind of like what we were doing with our ordered pairs, swapping the x and the y. All right, so now we need to get this y alone. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get rid of my negative. So that negative out front, because we don't want to we don't want to have that there anymore. So it's like a negative 1 that's being kind of multiplied. We want to undo that by dividing it. So it's a negative x equals my y plus 1 cubed. How do I undo something that's cubed? I do the cube root, and that cube root cancels that cube out. So now I have the cube root of negative x equals y plus 1, and we have one last step, and that's to get rid of that plus 1 by subtracting. Now this is going to go behind. It's not underneath the radical because this is all the cube root over here. So it just kind of goes behind. It's not actually underneath that radical. And then the last step is to exchange that for an inverse function. And there you go. Oh, don't forget my negative. All right, so go ahead and try this one. Replace this with a y, then switch your x and y, then solve for y. Try it. If you get stuck, push play and follow along. Easiest way to do this one is to put this over 1 and cross multiply. So we're going to have an x minus 2 times a y minus 2 equals 4 times 1 or 4. Then we can get our y alone by dividing by this whole x minus 2 thing. And then we're just left with an x or a y minus 2 equals that 4 over x minus 2. And then the last step is to just add 2. So f inverse is 4 over x minus 2 plus 2.